So this next panel, we're going to look at pension crowd out, and I'm going to lead off by presenting some results of some case studies that we've done here. I've actually done a total of 14 case studies, counties, cities, one special district, and school districts. And I'll run through those very briefly today. The document itself will be available on the CPR website probably about the end of this week or the very beginning of this next week, of next week. So I'll start off, and then we'll turn to Chuck Reed, the former mayor of the city of San Jose, and then Deb Davis, who is a current council member in the city of San Jose. So I'll start with the question, are public pensions crowding out other spending? And of course, you know the answer is yes. The question is there a pattern? Is it more pronounced in certain areas? What's the magnitude of the crowd out? And so that's what I'll cover for the next 10 or so minutes. So as part of this, again, we've done case studies for the state of California. We looked at CalPERS and CalSTRS, did not look at the UC system. Then we looked at individual CalPERS employer agencies, and we have Palo Alto, Pacific Grove, Sacramento, Stockton, Vallejo, and then BART here in the Bay Area. Independent systems did the city of Los Angeles and 3 counties, Alameda, Los Angeles, and Moran. And again, those are separate from CalPERS. And then finally, did 3 case studies, one for LA Unified School District, Mill Valley School District, and Visalia. And so here are some of those projections. And I will spend a little more time on this slide because I need to give you some of the background for the methodology. So this is for County of Los Angeles annual contributions. And there's the black bars, which are historic. That's just what they have been paying into the system the last several years. There's the blue bars, which is the baseline projection. The baseline projection assumes that all assumptions are met going forward. So if a system has, a 7% discount rate, we assume that they earn that discount rate going forward. The alternative projection includes the assumption that they actually earn 2% less than the discount rate, so 5 to 5.5%, somewhere in that neighborhood. And for the County of Los Angeles, you see here that they actually have gone from currently about $1.5 billion that they're contributing. This is the employer contribution to pensions in the current year, and that's projected to get to about $2.5 billion by the year 2029, 2030. That's in the baseline scenario. Again, if they don't hit that investment target, if they're only at 5% instead of roughly 5%, I can't remember their exact discount rate versus 7%, then the 7% takes them up to about $3.3 billion, somewhere in that neighborhood. What's really important, I think, is also to look at to measure that as a share of their budget or their operating budget. So in this case, we looked at operating budget. The 2002 and 3 is not on the chart because we didn't have full data, but the 2002-3 number was about 3%. So County of Los Angeles was devoting about 3% of its operating budget to pensions in the year 2002-2003. That increased to about 8.7%, exactly 8.7% in the current year, and its forecast increased to either 10.2 or 13.8% in 2029 or 2030. Now you might look at that and say, well, they were at 3% and maybe they'll go to 14%. It's only 11% of their budget. And you'll probably hear from the mayor, the former mayor, and the council member that 11% is a pretty good chunk of your budget, in particular if it happens over a fairly short amount of time, which is what is happening here. So that's the story in the County of Los Angeles. City of Pacific Grove, an even more dramatic story. City of Pacific Grove went from pension contributions of about a little over $2 million in 2008-9. They're up to a little over $4 million today. And by 2029, 2030, they get up to about, well, actually the year before that, because they actually declined that last year. The reason for that is they have pension obligation bonds. They'll pay them off the year before. So that they actually get up to about $8 million in the alternative scenario. So again, they're going to go from about $2 million to potentially about $8 million over a fairly short amount of time. Even more dramatic if you look at the share of operating expenditures. The share of operating expenditures was only 2% in 2002 and 2003, very small number. That increased to 22.5%. This is probably one of the reasons that Pacific Grove was trying to find a way out of CalPERS a few years ago. They've gone from 2% to 23% in a very short amount of time as a share of their operating expenditures. And it's projected to increase to about 23.2% in the baseline scenario, 28% in the alternative scenario. So they're going to go to paying about 1/4 of their budget will be devoted to pensions in the city of Pacific Grove. Then the Mill Valley School District, and we picked Mill Valley because we actually, again, we looked at LA, Visalia, and Mill Valley. One of the reasons we did that is we wanted a large school district. LA fits the bill. A wealthy school district. Mill Valley fits the bill. Visalia, which is a low wealth school district. So I'll show you the Mill Valley here. So Mill Valley goes from a few years ago, about say $3 or $4 million spent on pensions. Today, it's about $4 million that they're spending. This is just the employer side, on pensions. And they will get up to about $8 million in 2029 and 2030. So again, the point here in all these cases, even if things go well, Mill Valley is going to see its expenditures on pensions double. And as a share of their operating expenditures, they're going to go from 8% currently to about 13 to 14%. And so again, this is happening over a fairly short period of time that with the new funding requirements for employers, they're currently, I believe it's 14.43% today, and that will end up hitting 19.1% in fiscal year 21. So we're only 3 years away from 21%, and they were at 8.25%. So they've gone from 8.25% to almost 20%, 19.1% in a very short amount of time, at about a 7-year period. The theme that emerges in these 14 case studies that we've done suggests the following. State of California, what's getting squeezed out there from these increases, these increased pension costs, are social services and higher education in particular. Social services in particular at the state level. So as the state has had to increase that amount that it's put in for state employees, this is not for local employees obviously, social services, the share of the budget has declined considerably. Higher education, the same thing. Higher education bumped up a little bit this last year, but it's still, overall, there's a downward trend there. What's happening in counties, and again, they're just 3 case studies that we've done, but in counties, what we're seeing is a decreased spending share, in particular in public assistance. So the irony here is that as pension costs increase and as these counties continue to fund these pensions, the people who are arguably being hurt the most are the people who can least afford it, the people who need that social assistance from counties. In fact, in a county of Los Angeles, it's almost a 1-to-1 trade-off. It's almost a dollar increase in pensions has led to a dollar decrease in public assistance. Other counties, you see healthcare being squeezed out as well. So those are the 2 things in the counties. At the city level, and we'll hear whether this is the same with San Jose, but the city levels, I'm calling these soft services, services that don't have strong constituencies, libraries, museums, parks, recreation, environment, public works, is generally what's happening in those. Those are the services that are being squeezed at the city level. And school districts, and again, I'll admit that we did less budget analysis on the school district side, but what seems to be happening in school districts is they're squeezing salaries. So as the pension obligations, or excuse me, the pension contributions increase, they are decreasing salaries. So either they're holding salaries down, so employees could be paying, or they're hiring fewer people. But the salary number is, as a share of the budget over this time period has decreased. Again, we should have this out into this week, beginning of next week. And I'll turn it over to Mayor Reed.
Thanks for inviting me back to Cyper. I made a few appearances back in the days when I was mayor and working on this issue. So it's interesting to come back and talk to some of the same people and look at what's happened over the last few years. But before I get into the San Jose experience, I need to do some disclosures. So first, I'm a Kennedy Democrat, and that's John, not Teddy. And some of you in the room are old enough to know the difference. I am a CalPERS pensioner, and I want to make sure I get paid every penny that I earned. While I was mayor, we went to the ballot 3 times on pension reform issues and 5 times on taxes. So we took a variety of approaches. I've concluded that the defined benefit system is an important part of our retirement security for our country, and that it has value, but at the same time, it's clear that it is inherently unstable. It is desirable, but it is risky. I'll get a little bit of the risk later on. I also think taxpayers ought to get a reasonable amount of service for the taxes that they pay. I'm currently serving as the chairman of the board of Retirement Security Initiative. We're a bipartisan advocacy organization focused on trying to make public pension plans and systems fair and solvent around the country. This slide that's up is my one-page summary of my years in elective office in San Jose, 6 on the council and 8 as mayor. And crowd out was an ever-present problem during the time period. So we had 10 years of cutting services every year to balance the budget. And in 2011, the council adopted a fiscal reform plan, which included pension reform going to the voters. And what people often miss is that the pension reform was only part of it. Because as I've discovered looking not just around the state of California, but around the country, you can't solve the problems with pensions with pension reform by itself. The problem is too big, that you have to look to a broader range of things, and that's what we did in San Jose with our fiscal reform plan. Of course, after we adopted our fiscal reform plan, we've had a few good years, not great years, but a little bit of green is a lot better than a lot of red. So we've been able to modestly restore services in San Jose as a result of the fiscal reform efforts that included the pension reform ballot measure that we went to the voters on. So I'll talk a little bit about the San Jose experience historically, and I'll let Dave talk about, Davis talk a little bit more about the current issues in San Jose. We surprised the country in 2012 with our pension reform plan that was approved by the voters on the same day that San Diego approved a pension reform plan. In June of 2012, we got a nearly 70% vote. I say nearly 70% because I get accused of exaggerating because it was only 69.6%. So rounding to 70%, which was a surprise because I'm a Democrat mayor with a Democrat council and a Democrat city and a Democrat county and a Democrat state, the deep blue Democrat state. How could we possibly get the voters to approve pension reform over the objections of our public employee unions? So I usually explain to audiences around the country a little bit about San Jose. First, we're the capital of Silicon Valley, 10th largest city in the country. Our general obligation bond ratings are AA1 or AA plus. We've been chasing or competing for number one in job creation for years. We're usually number one or number two with some city in Texas. We've never taken a pension holiday. We've always paid what used to be called the ARC and is now the ADEC. We have 2 independent plans, and since their inception, they've earned more than 7.5%. And yet, we had billions of dollars in unfunded liabilities. So when we decided to do our pension reform plan, that was the backdrop. Why did we decide to take on pensions? Because the alternative was worse. 10 years of cutting service to balance the budget. We had reached the end of the line in cuts. You know, when you're laying off cops and firefighters, you're pretty much out of things that you can do in terms of cutting services. We had gone from a workforce of 7,400 employees to a workforce of 5,400 employees, 2,000 positions eliminated. Most of those by attrition, which is the boil the frog slowly approach to dealing with the problems. And then we actually did layoffs. And again, that included police officers and firefighters. Our infrastructure backlog, maintenance that we should be doing on infrastructure grew to $1 billion. And every department in the city took a hit. It wasn't just the soft services. And we started looking at the rising costs, pensions, and this slide includes our retirement costs, pension and OPEB combined, because it doesn't really matter, it takes money. And they grew enormously. I show this slide around the country, and the point is, I take San Jose's name off that slide, I can put 1,000 jurisdictions on there, it's the same slide. Doubling and tripling of payments over a relatively short period of time. And so we had to take on pension reform as an element of our fiscal reform plan because the alternative was worse, service delivery insolvency or bankruptcy. And we went as far as we could cutting services. And we eventually reached the point where a majority of Democrats and 100% of my one Republican were able to support pension reform and put it on the ballot, and we got a 70% yes vote. And that's in a city that has a huge Democrat to Republican registration margin. On the theme for today is the crowd out. This is a slide that I used when I was mayor in my budget meetings to explain what was going on to my people. And this is a story that's repeated over and over again. You'll see it in the case studies that Joe has mentioned that are representative. Funding went up, but staffing went down. Now, I know perhaps we got a lot more efficient, we did all this technology and on and on. That's not the way it works in local government. We deliver services with people. And when the staffing goes down, we're delivering less services. And even though funding went up substantially here in our police department, our staffing went down. And that's because the cost was going up a lot faster than the revenues and a lot faster than we could put money in it. The unit cost was going up dramatically and did. Now, when the police chief's in the room, I always say this is our most important department, police department. If the fire chief's in the room, maybe I have a little hedge on that. But nevertheless, in most local governments, police is considered a core service. It's not one of those soft services that Joe was talking about. It's a core service. And if you look at police departments around the state, we're not the only one that has suffered a staffing in our police department. But I can run this graph against the fire department. It looks about like this. Other departments look a lot worse because those softer services did take larger hits. Money, let's have more money. Let's put more money in, and we did. Through those 10 years of budget cuts, we managed to balance the budget, even though we put more money in with less people. But San Jose's not an outlier. The costs for pensions have doubled or tripled over the last decade or so around the country. And the service delivery problem is a huge problem for local governments. If you took this same graphic and tried to duplicate it for other cities. I'm actually going to tell you how to do this pretty easily. Open a CAFR to your favorite city. And there's like 300 pages of gobbledygook. Most people can't get through it, but just skip the first 150 pages. You know, that's actuarial speak and economist speak, and all that stuff you heard this morning is all very interesting, but it doesn't really give you the answer. Go down into the statistical section of any CAFR. They're almost all the same. Statistical section. It's about 150 pages in. There are three pieces of data, three sources of data that you can use to create this kind of a graphic for your city. First is not on here, and that's population. But there's a statistical page in there that shows you the population over the last 10 years. It's an interesting fact because maybe your city shrank, maybe your services should shrink, but most of them, the city grew. The second is staffing. It's usually entitled full-time equivalent employees. Sometimes it's full-time and part-time, but typically it's full-time equivalent employees. And you get 10 years of staffing data. And then there's another one on spending. It's usually titled changes in fund balances or changes in net positions. And you can look on these 3 pages at the individual departments in almost all cities and see the impact of crowding. Because like in San Jose, you can see that spending is going up generally and staffing is going down. And some departments are worse than others, and you can have some idea of where it's impacting the most. Now, it's not because they got more efficient. It's because costs were going up faster than revenues. You can only do that for so long. For example, if you take Palo Alto. Now, Palo Alto is our host city here, the birthplace of Silicon Valley, the mother lode of Silicon Valley, and by my standards, an extremely wealthy city. And by my standards, it's per capita income. Much higher per capita income in Palo Alto than San Jose. Even in Palo Alto, where they have a lot of resources to pull from, you look at those numbers and you'll see that the funding in the police department's up by about 50%. The staffing is down by 10%. Now, I'll let you figure out through all the rest of the CAFRs exactly where everything went. But if you look city by city, you will see staffing is down. Staffing is down despite the fact that revenues are generally up, expenditures are generally up. And why is that? It's because of the crowd. Expenses go up faster than revenues, and it's almost always the case with California governments and nationally. You get the crowd out. So that's the San Jose story. At the time I left office, I'll let Deb Davis pick it up. She's come in since then, and I know, unfortunately, I left her a lot of problems yet to be solved. So we didn't want Deb not to have anything to do.
So there wasn't overlap between Chuck's tenure and my coming on the council. I am newly elected as of November 2016, so I just took office in January, so there was a little bit of time, a gap between our tenures. So I'm gonna recap a little bit of about what happened after Chuck left office. I do wanna make sure everyone knows I'm the council liaison to the Federated Retirement Board, so you've already heard that San Jose has 2 retirement boards. There's a police and fire, and then the rest of the employees are in Federated. And I've learned a lot in the first 8.5 months that I've been on the council, but everything I'm talking about is really just my perspective as a new council member. And I'll be talking about kind of overall what those perspectives are, and then talking about the crowd-out impacts, both monetary and non-monetary, because I think that's important. From a policy standpoint, we have to put it in perspective of everything that's going on in a city or in a jurisdiction, not just thinking about the bottom line, because there's much more to consider. So our general fund is just over $1 billion, just kind of give you a little bit of background. And before the reform that Chuck was talking about, which we call Measure B, pension costs were projected to be about 30% of the general fund in the years that I'm talking about, so just kind of 14, 15, 15, 16. And pension costs, what they ended up being, instead of 30% of the general fund, ended up being about 22% of the general fund as a consequence of enacting Measure B. And in the current year, we're actually projected to have a general fund of about $1.27 billion and our pension costs will be about 20% of that general fund. So LA County's 8.7% looks really good to me. But I guess the way that we think about it on the council now, so there are 4 new members of an 11-member council, 10 plus the mayor. And then there are a number of council members who have been on since Chuck's time. There are still 3 people remaining from that time. And the way that I look at it is Measure B was necessary to rein in costs. Part of the reason that I ran was because of those soft services being cut when my kids were really little, and us not being able to go to the library because it wasn't open every day of the week, and the parks weren't being well maintained, so it wasn't a great place to take your kids. And when the kids are little, you really want to be out and about because you can't keep them home, you'll go crazy. So Measure B was necessary from my perspective to rein in those costs, but there were unintended consequences for Measure B. And I think that everybody who lived in San Jose since then would agree. We had workforce attrition that we didn't anticipate, so it was greater than anticipated. Part of that was because CalPERS Tier 2 was better than our Tier 2. We've all heard about the problems with CalPERS Tier 2, so there are issues with that, but we had to grapple with the reality that we had, which was that workers wanted to go where the benefits were better, whether or not they were sustainable. Doesn't matter to that individual. And so we had to deal with workforce attrition, especially with police force. So what we did, this was before, I say we, but I wasn't on the council at this time, but the new mayor, Sam Liccardo, and this was a measure that was supported by Chuck Reed, negotiated with the unions to kind of blunt some of the impact of Measure F with a new measure, Measure B, with a new measure called Measure F. And so what that did, talking to some of there was conversation earlier about how pension costs are not or the level of benefits are not at the discretion of the boards. Well, now, there are no retroactive pension increases without the will of the voters. So everybody will have that discussion going forward as a result of Measure F. It also dealt with long-term healthcare costs, so that OPEB that we were talking about. And what it did to help bring employees kind of back into the fold to deal with that attrition issue is that employees who were former employees of San Jose coming back can come back into Tier 1. That was really important, and I think it was important for 2 reasons. It was important to address the attrition issue, especially with the police department, but also because it helped with the relationship just to improve the labor relations with all of the unions. So there are 11 unions in San Jose. I don't know if anybody's talked about that yet today. So there's a lot of bargaining units. But actually coming to an agreement before going to the voters, which was something that wasn't possible with Measure B, helps to improve the relations and keeps the employees' morale, helps to rebuild that morale, I guess is what I want to say. The staff, city staff, and the city council members and the mayor who were there at the time still talk about the time between 2010 and 2015. The organization kind of bears those scars. And I think it's important to think about that, is that when you enact these reforms, even if they're needed, there are going to be these consequences that you have to deal with over many, many years. So your bottom line may get a little bit better, but there are trade-offs there. And that's something to really consider very seriously. So in terms of the crowd-out impacts, what we've been able to do, so from my perspective, Chuck and the councils that he was on had to deal with all of those huge deficits. You saw all those negative numbers, and I'm coming in on the more positive side. So we have some much smaller positives and much smaller negatives to deal with. For us, it's about restoring the services that had to be cut over those 10 years that Chuck was talking about. And we, in addition to that, restoring the services is not just restoring the funding, but getting the people back. And so our discussions are more about how do we get people to want to work here again? How do we get people excited about being part of the city of San Jose again? And we're having to do that. We're having to restore our services more slowly because our pension costs are continuing to rise. So just a little example, we raised our sales taxes in 2016, and the amount of revenue that we're projected to get for this first year equaled the amount of additional pension costs when I first got to the council. So that was about, because the pension funds didn't meet their targets. So that was about $40 million. So right away, great, we've put forward this sales tax saying, you know, we're gonna use it for libraries and parks and pavement maintenance, and nobody talks about sewer maintenance, but that's one of the things it was gonna be used for. But really what we're doing is paying for the pensions, because otherwise we would have had to cut. So we'll only be able to increase very slowly as our revenue increases. But we want to talk about not only the monetary crowd-out impacts, but the non-monetary crowd-out impacts, and I've kind of touched on this a little bit. Employee morale, recruiting and retention, and also just the discussion, the public discussion. When you're talking about pensions, you're not talking about other issues. So now, that's something that everybody kind of in San Jose, the pensions are behind us. We're gonna deal with the costs, we're gonna deal with the risks and all of that kind of stuff that we talk about at our pension board. But now we can talk about innovation and doing more with tech within the city and streamlining our hiring processes to fill vacancies faster, because that's something that we really need to do. San Jose is hiring, and we need to do it faster so that we can restore those services for the budget that we have. But also, the police department. The chief now is talking about 21st century policing reforms and has enacted, I think it's 17, Paul, you can tell me, 17 new reforms in the police department. And that's something that they couldn't have talked about 4 years ago, because it was all about the pensions and it was just crowding out the discussion about what everybody was doing. We're also talking about San Jose Clean Energy. We're starting our own energy company. 5 years ago, we wouldn't have even thought of talking about that. There was just no room in the discussion and no room in the budget to put seed money down. And we have that now. And we're talking about big developments to actually grow our revenue. So Google wants to come downtown, Adobe wants to expand, and we're able to put the staff time into helping those projects move along so that we can grow our revenue. So while Chuck didn't solve every problem, and the council didn't solve every problem, I think I thought it was important to give kind of a more positive perspective. I think what we talk about in the retirement boards is we have to manage risk, but it is manageable. And we have a plan for paying off our tier 1 unfunded liabilities, and it's not gonna be painless, but there's a little bit more room now to talk about other things. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, so let me know when we're out of time, Olympia. Okay, so questions from anyone, and we've got mics, so because the best way to do this is just have someone, you know, hold up your hand, someone will come with you to you with a mic. And then the people who are watching this being streamed will actually be able to hear your questions. So questions on crowd out or, you know, theoretical level, real level, future level, questions on that? Yeah, Josh.
For Chuck, would you advise cities in California that are facing these kinds of problems now not make changes or attempt to make changes that would affect current employees, but focus only on new hires? And I ask because, as you mentioned, San Diego had reformed around the same time where they reduced many of the workers on 401k plans, and that reform has not faced as much resistance. And my understanding is that it hasn't created too many problems with morale and other issues.
Well, I don't think you can reach that conclusion if you're trying to solve your problem. It depends on the scope of your problem. Because while it is possible to do things with new employees, those are relatively small dollars, especially in the short run. The real money, the real expenses are for your current employees and your current retirees. And depending on the scope of your problem and how long you wait. If you wait another 20 years, you're going to have to, do horrible things. The earlier you act, the easier it is, but it's also more difficult to convince people to act. But I don't think very many jurisdictions will be able to solve their existing problems just by doing things with new employees. But fundamental to all of that, and I'll talk a little bit about it in the next session on pension reform around the country, is you got to put more money in. All of these solutions all come back, you got to put more money in. And there's no way to do this without putting more money in.
With the mic.
You never indicated what the reforms were that were approved by the voters. Could you just comment on that?
So in San Jose, we did a series of things in the Measure B ballot in June of 2012. We, like others, decided we needed a different level of benefits for new employees, so we established a second tier for new employees. We changed some of the medical benefits. We prohibited the payment of a 13th bonus check out of surplus earnings. Detroit made that famous. And we attempted unsuccessfully to make our current employees pay a lot more to maintain their accrual rate for their current accrual rates. We gave them a choice of either paying a lot more or opting for a different level of benefits that looked a lot like the new Tier 2. So those were what were approved by the voters. And Dev can talk a little bit more about the negotiations, but ultimately with the negotiations on the Measure F, the dollars pretty much stayed the same in terms of the savings, but the mix of some of the elements got shifted.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Gray Tanaka. I'm on the Palo Alto City Council. I have a question for Joe. So in your case study, I was wondering if, I saw you talked about a few other cities, but I was wondering for Palo Alto if you could talk about what did you see in terms of percentage of budget, between 2007 to now to, in the future?
I haven't committed all of them to memory. I apologize. But in a few minutes, I can get that for you. But it's, as Mayor Reed said, it's essentially the same sort of story in Palo Alto as you see elsewhere. The one thing that jumps out at me about Palo Alto is that it is in relatively worse shape than its neighbors in terms of the unfunded obligations here. The unfunded obligation, I do know this from memory, I think on a market basis, Palo Alto is $1.2 billion. Has $1.2 billion in unfunded pension liabilities. That's a lot for a city of 68,000 people. Behind you, yeah.
Paul Gullickson, Press Democrat. So I'm just interested because the narrative we're hearing from a lot of cities, and particularly labor unions, is we don't want to do what San Jose did because the narrative is you had all these reforms and everybody quit the police department. And I know the truth is more nuanced than that. But the question I'm asking is, what is sort of come out on the last question? What is it that voters can take or cities can take from your experience? Is the solution to go to voters for reform measures? And on that same note, I also want to ask Mr. Reed about the likelihood of a state measure, where we stand on that.
Let me take on what San Jose did. San Jose did not want to do what San Jose did. So I don't blame anybody else for not wanting to do what San Jose did. Pension reform is difficult. It's dirty work. It's a lot of heavy lifting. It is done because you lack a good alternative. In San Jose's case, the alternatives were worse, and we decided to do it. Now, you can't expect to cut all the employees' pay by 10% modify their pension benefits, reorganize their departments, and have them be happy. You can't do pension reform without an impact on your workforce. And you just have to calculate that in and figure out how you're going to deal with it. And in San Jose, we had lost hundreds of police officers as we were cutting the services to balance the budget every year. And we were going to continue to lose police officers. And when we decided to do pension reform, it was to stop the loss of police officers. Now, we continued to lose them through attrition, and it was a recruiting problem. I think we're now beyond the recruiting problem and beyond the attrition, but this is not easy. And you can't just say, well, we're going to do pension reform and not expect it to have some impact on your workforce. You just have to plan for that and account for that. One of the things that we did in San Jose is we went back through individual departments, and where we had high rates of attrition, difficulty holding on to employees, and difficulty recruiting, we went back and made pay raises and restored some of the pay cuts. In some cases, more than restored the pay cuts, department by department basis. So the impacts are not uniform, but you can't close your eyes to the fact that it will have an impact on your workforce. So they're not going to be happy. Nobody is happy when you're doing pension reform.
The fact is, you wouldn't have been able to do any of these things without going to voters. This was, right?
In San Jose, we would not have been able to go without going to the voters.
So the way it worked for Measure F was the measure was negotiated with the labor unions first, and then went to the voters, because it has to be ratified by the voters anyway, according to San Jose's charter. But it was negotiated as a settlement beforehand. And that was attempted, I believe, before Measure B as well. Is that right, Chuck?
Yes.
So there's different leadership now in some of the unions than there was then. And there was more of a willingness, I think, more of a recognition of the problem and a willingness to try to find a solution that was palatable to everybody. And that's happened elsewhere. So I think in Omaha, they've been able to negotiate agreements for pension reform before they go to the voters without really detrimental impacts to morale.
Going to the voters is an option really that's limited. San Jose has independent plans, San Diego had an independent plan. There aren't that many independent plans. There's a few dozen independent plans and a few Act 37 county plans. Almost everybody is in CalPERS or CalSTRS. Going to the voters doesn't help you very much. Your elected officials are going to have to negotiate deals with your unions. That's the reality. So we need better elected officials, for starters. David Crane will be happy to talk about that, I'm sure.
Yes.
I have a question, if maybe you can address intergenerational equity a little bit further. Drew brought this up earlier. When I think about those individuals that retired where expectations were we'd earn 8%, benefits weren't that high, now they're near retirement or quickly shift into retirement, it seems like their contributions to the plan may have been meager compared to current active employees. Is there an alternative way to look at addressing as benefits change so it doesn't fall on the back of active workers?
Intergenerational equity is a huge issue because we've shifted enormous debt to our children and our grandchildren. There's just no way to avoid that given the unfunded liabilities that we have now. And yes, people who retired or are about to retire vastly underfunded the obligation throughout the course of their career, but they paid what we told them to pay. And it's not their fault that it was underfunded, but the reality is it was underfunded. So in San Jose for our retiree health care, our employees are paying all along for retiree health care at about 1%. The cost is like 20% is what we know today. So we vastly underfunded the retiree health care. Same thing with pensions. And that's why the discussion about the discount rate this morning was very interesting, because you can argue all you want about discount rate, and trust me, we got guys here who can argue about that for weeks. It doesn't change the cost of the benefit. The benefits cost what the benefits cost. We owe the employees the benefit, and if it costs us $2 to pay them, we got to pay $2. The discount rate just shifts how and when you're going to collect the money. There are very important issues to that, but it doesn't change the cost. And so if you're underfunding the cost today, that means somebody's going to have to make up for it later. And that'll be, our kids and grandkids.
Can I jump in real quickly? So I think if you had more equity and more risk sharing between employer and employee, number one, you'd probably have more realistic benefits. I mean, I'm going to say this, I think everyone knows that benefits are generally too high. I mean, they just are. And so there has to be some reform there. But if you had that equity, and if a public employee didn't have his or her contribution capped at 7 or 8 or 9%, while the city's paying 50%, or if the employee had to be liable for at least some of that unfunded liability, responsible for that, then I think there'd be a different tenor at the negotiating table. So, I mean, I think there have been attempts to move to a place where there's an equal sharing of the cost. And if you got to that point, and I think voters, you know the polling better than I do, but I think voters generally support that. They say, yeah, it's a shared responsibility. The employee and the employer ought to pay about the same thing. It's not what happens today. It's very lopsided in favor of the employee paying a very small share.
For San Jose, our Tier 2 does pay 50-50 for the unfunded liability.
I think we do one more question. Anyone else? Oh, right over here.
I'd like to build on the generational question a little bit and ask Mr. Nation if you've done any research around the trends that have been predicted around the attitudes that are seen in the polling of millennials and the notion that millennials are perhaps less likely to consider themselves to stay in the same job as long as previous generations, may have less of an appetite for defined benefits, whether or not you've done any research into what that might mean in terms of who's funding the plans in 10 or 20 years as we're trying to get to 100% in 30.
Right, I have not, but the one thing I'll point to is something I mentioned this morning. I mentioned that the University of California system now offers an option for a defined contribution or defined benefit, and a third of the people this last cycle opted for the defined contribution plan. And I think it's because they assume that they will be there for a fairly short amount of time, 5 or 10 years, as opposed to 30 years. There may be somebody else, Josh, or someone else who knows a little bit about that, but I don't know anything that's been done specifically on that question.
I can just add to that. There's been quite a bit of research around the country surrounding teachers. Because if you look at the attrition rates of teachers when they come into the system, when they leave, probably half of the teachers don't really get any real benefit out of the defined benefit system, either because they leave before it's vested at all, or they leave early in their careers because they tend to be backloaded, and they're really good for teachers who spend their entire career in the same system. But if you're moving around, and so the structure of the defined benefit plans that exist generally around the country are not really good for the millennial workforce, but they haven't been good for young teachers for a long time. And that trend probably continues with people moving from job to job.
Let's do one more question, Bill.
Question, it's a statement. I apologize. Yes, but in some ways, defined benefit were designed to attract people who want to stay and to keep them there. All the issues you can think about, police. So there is a sort of there are two aspects of that trade-off.
All right, thank you. Next one.